Thank you to every and each of one of you. I'm very happy to be here, finally meeting some people personally after all the discussions in the previous year. And after the speeches, let's do what this project is about. And of course, this is the discussion and dialogue. Ernest Hemingway once wrote that how do people fall into bankruptcy? And he said, gradually and then suddenly. And I like also the cartoon from Roadrunner, who is always chased by the wild coyote. And the wild coyote very often goes off the road and he runs across some canyon, but he runs through the air. And then he usually stops because he didn't even notice that he's above the canyon. And then he stops, looks down, realizes that he's above the canyon, and then he falls down. Now, I believe, as a sort of trying to be positive about this discussion, is that our task is in a way trying to prevent or to do our contribution to the, let's say, European society as a whole, trying to prevent it from running above the canyon and then suddenly realizing that we are actually above the canyon. And we have gradually and then suddenly fallen into that canyon. So let's start this dialogue about our both projects, but also about the topics that Aidan has opened, and there is a number of these topics. But let me start first by asking perhaps Daphne. Aidan has mentioned that they have analyzed more than 400 code of ethics, and that each one of these societies actually needs their own code of ethics. How do we, as a pan-European project with a number of stakeholders, countries, and so on, can do something that would overcome those national perspectives, limitations, and also sort of go above very general sort of descriptions, which then very often tend to be bland, in the sense that they are safe. And I think that if I remember correctly, the constitution of Soviet Union also had an amble where it says that the media in Soviet Union is free. So how do we prevent this sort of bland descriptions of accountability and responsibility and transparency, but at the same time take into consideration that, of course, we are a wider framework?
Thank you, Marko, for giving me the floor with a very difficult question. First of all, thank you for having me here, and it's an honor to me to be on this advisory board of this very ambitious and important project. I'm not sure whether I can answer your question, because I hope that this project will answer your question. If we already have this answer, there shouldn't be this project. There's no need for us to have this project, I think. One of the challenges, I believe, is how to find these common values. I was telling Krisztina this morning that I see a lot of challenges for this project, and luckily it's the beginning of the project, and hopefully it can solve the challenges. And Krisztina told me, you're in the advisory board to give us some critical questions, and we are scientists, and give us some problems, because as scientists we love problems. So I'm not sure whether I should be the one now to answer this, because I think this is one of the major challenges here. I would say a problem, but the problems, it's for me a negative, it is a kind of negative word. A challenge is more positive, I think. And when my background is, I'm the Secretary General of the Netherlands Press Council, and I'm in an alliance of European press councils, where is in the understanding that since we are coming from several backgrounds in each country, you can have some common values which are written down in the IFJ standards, which are very, I think, very vague and are common to all countries. But when it comes to the national codes, I have a problem with the word code, by the way, coming from the Netherlands. The journalists in the Netherlands very much do not like the word code because it sounds like a law, and Dutch journalists do not want to be bound by a code. So therefore in the Netherlands, our code is called guidelines. So one of the things is, I mentioned it already in the online meeting we had in March, if it is possible for this project, whatever you do for the Netherlands, please do not call it a code, but something else that sounds more friendly, like principles or something like that. But anyway, sorry. In the European Alliance, it's quite, we are agreeing that it is very hard, or at least maybe impossible, to have specific values for each country coming from different social and economical, political backgrounds. So where this project, I'm not sure what the project really would like to do. It's not clear to me yet. Is it to have one code, better set of principles for all the countries, or and then I think when it's coming, when you want one set of principles, I only can see very vague ones which will apply to every country. And to it's not only every country, the project is including a lot of actors, a lot of stakeholders. It's not clear to me yet, will you, is it including the professionals, the journalists as well, or not? Is it about the individual citizens of the countries? I understood that it is as well for the principles are for other groups that are providing information as well. It is a lot of stakeholders, a lot of actors. So how can you set, how can you have a set of principles applying to so many without being vague? That's, oh, I'm not sure. You gave me this question, and I think this is one of the main challenge, as I see it, to this whole project. How coming to this set of principles for so many people, so many actors that will be bound by this set of principles.
Thank you. I think that your example with the Dutch journalists' sort of reaction to the attempt to establish either a code or any sort of regulation or self-regulation in terms of communication is a very good sort of example of the attitude of so many stakeholders within our societies. And that is, of course, that they very often, of course, they advocate their perspective, but they don't see, I wouldn't say to see the wider picture, but they don't, of course, take it into account in a way. And for example, Media Freedom Act, the proposal is a very good example, where many media associations and also some countries such as Germany or some landers in Germany or also Netherlands are opposing to many aspects or the act itself, which is like unneeded. And at the same time, they are the main advocates of even stronger restrictions within the act itself when it comes to the platforms. So they would like the platforms to be very strictly regulated. They want the government regulation of the taxes of the platforms. They would like all these sort of things, and yet within the same act, at the same time, when it comes to them, they say the act is not needed as such. So of course, I think we will have this sort of challenge of persuading each and one of these stakeholders, whether it comes to civil society, whether it comes to journalists, but also publishers and anybody. And as you mentioned, the diplomatic language is very important, setting the principles or just recommendations and so on, which means that we ourselves will need to be in itself general and bland. But I'm aware of that. I would like to ask Dainius about the journalistic, so to speak, sort of role within this dialogue, as we talked about the dialogue. And that is that Aidan was talking a lot about the even more engagement with the audience. But what we have seen over the past 20 years of the so-called so-called interaction with the public and audience, particularly through the comments on the websites of media itself, under the articles, for example, that was one of the main sort of forms of communicating with the audience, of engaging with the audience, giving them the voice, or then on the social media. But yet both of these forms, which were supposed to help the engagement and help also the sort of democratization of these things, where journalists were previously sort of very undemocratic gatekeepers controlling what can be said and what cannot be published and so on. But the comments on the website and the comments on social media by the audience have very often turned out actually to be a very dangerous sort of proposition. The journalists themselves were often taking down the comments when it came to them. They were threatened on social media, particularly women journalists and so on, members of different minorities, and there were all sort of issues with this sort. So how do we sort of encourage engagement and yet at the same time encouraging only the right engagement?
Thanks for the question. I would like to start with one of basics, which was mentioned by Aidan, for example, humanity, as very important value for journalism also. In media law in Lithuania, we have this value since 1996, I guess. And I remember one of first discussions between journalists who, same like me, I started my career as a journalist who was dealing with crime stories. And we started a discussion in my country about death penalty. Most of journalists who started career as me with crime stories, they said, we need death penalty for sure. And we had a lot of arguments. We have some people, some persons who are not humans. They are beasts, you know. And I remember we had discussions even in society. And especially during this time, 1995, 1996, in Lithuania, media which provided stories, crime stories, was very popular. And many journalists, they take a position from the very beginning as a so-called prosecutors in some way, not judges, not lawyers who protects human rights and something, but as a real prosecutors. Why I'm telling this? During pandemic, we had almost the same situation, talking about split society, about, for example, question of vaccination. We had here in Lithuania many journalists who also supported vaccination as a process, very hardly, very positive, sometimes very aggressively. And I remember some kind of discussions, even in public broadcaster, do we need to create some bad conditions for people who are against vaccination? Even they mentioned like life like hell or something like that. And I remember the hard discussions in social media, especially on Facebook with journalists, why it's so complicated if you take a position, a clear position in polarized community with so-called humanity values protecting someone and restricting also someone. And restrictions, even for media people, for journalists, restrictions even in field like, I don't know, taking some products in a store was also very complicated topic. And I would say this exam was very complicated for most of journalists. And media people, and even professional journalists, they asked for the moment, I would say, very confused about so-called values like humanity. If we see every day in Ukraine dying people, many journalists, I see also on Facebook, they are saying very clearly, these soldiers of Russia army, they are beasts, they are not humans. And I'm scared if journalists start to say, okay, I agree we need to protect victims in positive way. But if we start the same, position, some people are not humans. It's very dangerous position, especially for journalists, for media, and especially for public media, with special standards sometimes even in Lithuania. I would say, from my perspective, as a chair of Journalists Union, most complicated issue to collect journalists and especially editors to discuss with hard questions. What kind of definitions we would use in the future, talking about humanity, but also putting some people are not humans. It's very complicated, but very dangerous if we start to split all humans in humans and not humans. Because after that, even death penalty, some journalists also I saw on Facebook, they said they need not just death penalty, double, triple death penalty or something like that. It seems sometimes emotionally I agree on that. Look, I am also human. But if I look at a journalist from human values perspective, for me it's a big mistake putting to public sphere as a journalist such kind of position. That's why I am, for the moment, really interested in this project, because dialogue, in many cases, even for journalists, is not the main tool to solve some problems. We are trying, in many situations, to find right position and wrong position. This is the biggest challenge for journalists, I guess, and even artificial intelligence sometimes I used, and ChatGPT also used by some of my colleagues. They are putting some names of some politicians who are good politicians and bad politicians, and they are providing this information for public sphere. I mean, guys, it can be like Joe, but not like real journalism. If you just put name or picture of this politician and you say, he looks like frog, or maybe like, I don't know, dragon or something like that, providing as information. I would say this type of games, also playing some kind of games, are also very dangerous for journalism. That's why I put it with two moments. If we are talking about values, humanity, and many of them, we need clear definitions, explanations, and sometimes trainings. I would say many type of new standards, I would say, also inside our community. What does mean humanity? Protecting victims, it's okay. Killing aggressors, double, triple, maybe not.
Thank you very much. Krisztina, I would like to hear your perspective from a, let's say, wider sort of view, because you are, of course, an academic, and you were, of course, engaged also with the Press Council. You come from Austria, but you were engaged, so to speak, also with other countries. So you bring in this sort of variety of potential perspectives. How do you look at these issues, both from academia, but also from media and council ethics, but also research, and of course also from different countries?
Thank you very much, Marko, and thank you for the questions you have sent ahead. Marko shared with us the questions a few days ago, basically about that we should have thought about how is this project going to make an impact. And for 2 days, I'm trying to think about how are we going to make an impact. And as you mentioned, my background is in law, regulation, and policy making. So if I may, I would bring into this discussion another aspect, and this is about policy impact. And I am trying to recall those days, basically a year ago, where I was invited by Tobias to join a group of drafting and thinking together, and I was trying to kind of, connect. And the moment, and I'm looking up at this moment, when I started to believe that I have a place and a role in this project was the moment when I realized what this connect could be, for example, from my perspective. And this is about, for me, and again, this is for debate, how can we connect these issues we are talking here about to ongoing or existing policy discourses? And I would definitely highlight two aspects. one of these and two kind of buzzwords in policy language: media literacy on the one hand, and journalism, and policies about journalism. And my kind of reading of this proposal and of this project that we were granted is, how do we make that intellectual connect substantiated with research data and with our very specific, very unique research methods we are going to use to connect the issue about media literacy with the issue about the future of journalism. And I think this is the connect that very, very much is missing right now in policy discourses, in, so to say, these discourses are totally siloed from my perspective. There's an absolute disconnect. So you have, on the one hand, for decades, talking about media literacy, digital literacy. It's totally like a sidelined issue about, there are teachers who should be concerned about, and there are, people who, and digital literacy especially went into, I think, a completely wrong direction. This more about like how you use your tablet, kind of, how can we sell more products in this sense? And we, at a certain point, totally forget about that whatever we do, it's about the recipients. It's about the people who read the news and their capacities, their skills, their abilities, their possibilities to engage, to critically engage, to reflect, to have agency for action. And I think these are the kind of the buzzwords or connection words. For me, they totally kind of, was the eye-opening moment, how we can make with our work, with this project's work, how can we make it happen that we finally make these siloed discourses into some kind of connection. And I believe there's a lot going on right now. So on the one hand, we have to really be very much vigilant about how we align with these frameworks. How do we align with the policy frameworks about media literacy, and how do we identify our key stakeholders? Because that is going to be one of the key, whether we stay siloed or whether we at least try to make this connect. So we have, on the one hand, the key policy stakeholders about media literacy. So we have several European Commission departments, the DG Connect, the DG Education. We have a European, and I'm focusing right now on the EU issues because we are an EU-funded project, obviously. So we have Media Literacy Expert Group. We have, very importantly, the networks of media regulators. One on the broader European level, the European Platform for Regulatory Authorities, so the EPRA group. On the other hand, we have the not currently called ERGA, which is going, or maybe not going, to become a board of regulators who are basically struggling with this task for decades. What to do about media literacy? What has to do a media regulator to do with media literacy? And they are desperately looking for this kind of connection. How can they be getting involved other than publishing reports and research on their websites on a yearly basis? We have the European Digital Media Observatory, and we have a lot of non-profit organizations. So this is the one hand. The other hand, we have press councils on national levels. We have journalists associations on the other level. All discussing their particular issues. And Marko, you mentioned the European Media Freedom Act proposal. This is one of the topical agendas right now on the European level, where, again, if you look into the public consultation about the proposal and the responses received by the European Commission, as you said, on the one hand, there are freedom fights by the press, by well-established media organizations. On the other hand, there are the fights and the lobbying by the platforms. Then we have, the political divide across Europe, Hungary and Poland against Germany and the Nordic countries. Who needs more freedom and these kind of discussions. But this kind of very important aspect, who is going to take care about the recipients? And this is my last remark here. We have a lot of promises in this project to produce those kind of outputs that could and should address well-targetedly, well-addressed, and very importantly, well-scheduled. Those kind of policy discourses, I think, where we could and should make an impact.
Thank you very much. And yes, of course, you can have immediate response, of course.
Is this on? Yeah. Reflecting on what you say about the recipients, I was thinking already, but now even more, as Aidan said, and I think in most countries maybe the percentages are a little bit different, but we all face polarized societies, I think. And what for me will be a question and a challenge is how to reach all these very critical citizens that now not reading and listen to the mainstream media, searching for their own sources. I think it might be quite easy to reach the citizens in the middle, but how to reach all these citizens that are not that do not trust media now? How can we make them trust this project and trust this set of principles? And I think that will be a very high challenge.
And this was actually my follow-up question for Aidan. I mean, related to this, and that is, in general, as you mentioned, the numbers of people on the fridge, sort of responding to the claims or believing the claims that COVID was a hoax, the mass media is a lie, all of these conspiracy theories and so on. Can we, I mean, not just us, but in a way wider society, journalistic association, or policymakers, in what way can you engage with them because everything else has failed by now? I mean, should we ask Donald Trump to become the member of the advisory board of this project?
Well, I'm always ready for innovation, but I've got a feeling that's a step too far. But look, I mean, I think it's really interesting. It's true. We should worry about this particular group, this fringe group, and the fragmentation and the polarization. I mean, I think it's right to be aware of it, to worry about it and so on, but do not allow it to dictate and to be determining how you behave. It seems to me there are always, and always have been actually, fringe players in politics, irrespective of where we are. And that's always been true of media. So one, we have to recognize, but we have to put it in perspective. The most important thing to do about it is to talk about it. The problem is that very often the media do not discuss where conspiracy theories are coming from. They do not discuss the infrastructure for connectedness that exists now between these various groups and so on. And I think the more discussion there is out in the open about what is going on will help people better understand the scale and the scope of these conspiracies that are being thought about and so on, and the nature of abusive communications. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to talk about it openly. Will help. Look, I mean, I agree. This project is undertaking a massive, enormous task, if not impossible task. But give it a go. But the point about it is there are two objectives here. One is help people to understand what good communications are. Define what those good communications are. Help them to be aware of where they need to go to receive information which is useful and reliable and so on. That's good. That's important. But actually, they've got to go somewhere. And we've got to provide them with the streams of reliable information that will be at the happy end of their rainbow that they're following. If we don't have a media system, or we don't have the pluralist systems that providing streams of useful and reliable information, then we're actually gearing people up for disappointment. We're saying, look, this is what we want you to be doing, want you to be aware of, and so on. And then they say, yeah, great, but where is it? I mean, well, you know, where do I find it? So there is a problem. There is a question also about the need to strengthen the quality of journalism, the quality of plurality in terms of the availability of useful information and so on. And that means there have to be practical steps taken to trying to strengthen journalism. I mean, and I think that's very difficult, because I think journalism is in more of a difficult corner than it's been for a long, long time. And Daphne rightly sort of points out, you know, how do you get codes and the terms that you use? And journalists are the first among those to be allergic to terms that they find particularly intrusive and so on. So I understand the question about the word code and so on, and the preference for principle. I remember the International Federation of Journalists in the 1930s, when they put together their code, they actually put them both together. They called theirs a code of principles for the conduct of journalism. I think that sort of basically covered everything. So even that is a negotiation. But we should remember, actually, codes are only the middle point of the pyramid that we're talking about here. When we look at media, they normally have a pyramid which begins with a very short statement. It's called the vision. Our vision is, the New York Times would say, all the news that's fit to print. That's their vision. So visions are always very short to the point. And then you have, in the middle, you have codes, the principles. This is what we would like to achieve. And then it's more detailed, it's more set out. And then at the bottom, and this is really the most important area, are the guidelines about how you take a principle and you put it into effect. So how do you take a principle regarding protection of sources of information? What does that mean in terms of how media report children, victims of violence, rights of minorities, and so on? You need guidelines. So, for example, you look at the Associated Press. They have a very detailed, straightforward code. It's quite short, but their book of principles, their book of guidelines is very detailed. The same with the BBC, the producers' guidelines of the BBC. It's like a great tome which you would use to keep your kitchen door open. But it's very detailed about how journalism needs to be practiced in your context. And the point about it is, in each country it's different. Those guidelines will be different according to the nuances and tendencies that come with different cultural traditions, religious traditions, political traditions, linguistic traditions, and so on. So let's recognize the reality of how codes and principles are put into effect and focus on building good guidelines. Good guidelines which people and journalists in their everyday work, for example, can use. People who are involved in public affairs, in civil society groups and so on, they can also sort of look at what are the guidelines. So it's very practical work. This is not work to be seen in the ivory towers of academia, although you are all from that. I'm very pleased to know that. It has to be grassroots guidelines, thoughts about how you put it into effect. So, I mean, that's my thought about it.
Thank you. Personally, I see the particular relevance of this project, actually, to be honest, not in trying to persuade or even sort of reaching out to the people on the fridges. Of course, we are open to all of that. But I think that, like in political marketing, I think it's the most important aim are the people who are sort of undecided, somewhere in the middle, and they represent the largest part of society. The people who are not so sure about Facebook, who are not so sure about seeing the picture from the beaches in Greece or anything else. And I think that this project will probably not even get to the people on the fridges, but we tend to, of course, address all those somewhere in between who are not perhaps aware of some of the issues or who are looking for certain guidelines, if not codes. So I believe that we can contribute in this part, and particularly regarding or following what Krisztina was saying, particularly because we in itself, the project, are very dialogical. We come from different background, whether it's ethical, journalistic, from councils, from academia in terms of legal aspects or regulation, drafting laws, or of course researchers or journalists themselves. So I'm pretty sort of hopeful also in that regard, because we are not, let's say, narrow-minded academics who only look at one particular theoretical aspect. I would like now to open also, of course, if there are any questions for a brief. I think that very briefly, I'm not sure what is exactly the hour, but I think perhaps we have a few moments. I'm looking at Krisztina as a big boss. Yes. Okay, so if there are any questions, but Krisztina wanted to add something, sorry.
Sorry, Daphne basically raised a question, and I just only thought that we might respond. How are we going to do that, right? So how do we reach out to the recipients, and how this project is going to particularly deliver to that? And just two really very brief remarks. First, the dialogue. So that the whole core idea about this project, how do we theorize dialogue? And how do we do through this theorization, this connection between journalists and the recipients, and how we do that? Then the work, how we look at how this is right now manifested on the side of the media, journalists, the codes, and this is what we are going to do, for example. How is it going to be, how can we test it with the recipients? And this is, again, where this unique methodology comes into, and then how can we deliver this kind of results? So obviously, this project is not going to talk each and every citizen in the European Union. I'm just joking, obviously. But I really believe that we are going to be able to deliver systemic ways how to make this connection. And here, I think, Marko, your last remark about the fringes. And you remember when we were, the two of us were thinking about for the input, why is it unique that these particular countries, these particular participants are in this consortia? And we tried to kind of think about how can we frame it like small countries, but small, smallness in Europe, it's not a big deal to be small, but it's more being a big deal being on those kind of fringes of Europe where it does make a difference. And I think our backgrounds, where we are coming from, this is what is kind of unique, how polarization works, how this disconnect can harm societies to an extent that is probably not so much well known in other parts of Europe. Sorry.
Thank you. Of course.
Two things. Because when I listen to all of us, I'm not sure if I heard it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we are talking a lot about the journalism side relating to civic society. But what my understanding was of this project is that we are not talking about only talk about professionalists. So this for me is a very big challenge, how to reach other media groups that give information that are not professionalists. That I very much like to know first, and if professionalists are included as well in this project, which is not really clear to me yet, how will be the relation to this new set of principles to all the existing codes in our countries. Because in our code, for instance, Ep was talking about the codes were made before social media, but I know that at least the guidelines in the Netherlands, but in a lot of countries as well, are amended to social media. So we do have specific guidelines where it comes to social media. So if the journalists are included in the project, how do you researchers see the relation to this new set of principles to this already existing codes. So these are my 2 points that I would like to add.
I think we're actually approximately out of time, but I'll just try briefly on behalf of our team, try to answer the question. We are not, so to speak, I wouldn't say arrogant, but or overambitious in a way. We are very ambitious, but we at the same time we realize that this is a horizon project. We are not established by European Commission to draft a European code act that will be empowered in all of the EU countries. We are merely a group of sort of mixed background stakeholders from academia, media, NGOs, and so on, trying to provide some sort of mostly scientific but also practical framework that will be useful for citizens of EU, whether it is journalists, whether it is media associations, NGOs, private citizens, educators, and of course policymakers and many others, including press councils and so on. So we are not here to actually establish a law. We are not here to empower something, and we will not meet with Ursula von der Leyen at the end of this, or perhaps not. It depends if what will be after the election of EU, and we are longer than the politicians, of course, we are academics. So it depends on that, how this sort of whole project will be accepted. We, of course, try to engage in dialogue with all the relevant stakeholders. I would say by accident, so to speak, there are mostly people from journalism and media background. There should be, of course, someone from platforms, so to speak. Perhaps they didn't want to come from California, but still, or China. But of course, it's an important part. Of course, there are NGOs as well, and they are in our group. So I think that we will try to address all of these issues, but particularly, of course, take into account all of these perspectives of different professional and other backgrounds, including policymakers, ethical councils, and of course other professionals, including of course social media. But to be honest, we are of course a project that does not have the sort of role of enforcing something, but if I made my Freudian slip, we've probably hoped to empower certain positive results and certain positive sort of dialogue into this society. I would like to thank you all. I know that you're already waiting for the lunch, so sorry if I took a few minutes of that. And thank you also to all the participants of this panel, and looking forward to the continuation after the lunch. Thank you. Thank you.